about Periander and Lycophron. I envision that some revised version of what I have to say today will appear as the last section of the last chapter, a very long manuscript I've been working on Herodotus and the Greek poetic tradition. It is my profound hope that its publication is pre-posthumous. In the meantime, I am very happy to have this opportunity to run some material by folks. So I'm really looking forward to getting some feedback on this. So thank you in advance. So I want to begin by providing broader context and briefly discussing the relationship between Herodotus and Sophocles, or between their works. It's a popular topic for scholarly speculation based on textual and extra-textual evidence. The extra-textual evidence includes an epigram quoted by Plutarch, apparently intended to accompany a song written by Sophocles at the age of 55 for one Herodotus, whom many understand to be the author of the histories. It strikes me as I look at this slide that I have a question about this epigram, which I will reserve for the Q&A session. The textual evidence includes parallel passages in the two authors, several of them geographical or ethnographical in nature, and their use of common story patterns, narrative techniques, and themes. The best known and most significant textual parallel is the one that you see before you, that between Antigone's rationale for burying her brother Polynices because of his irreplaceability, and Herodotus's story of Interfernes' wife, who uses similar reasoning to justify saving the life of her brother rather than her husband or a male child. I'm sure these passages will be more than familiar to most of you. I share the consensus view that Herodotus's story, in which Darius gives Interfernes' wife her choice of just one male relative to save, is the source text, which Sophocles has adapted somewhat awkwardly in his play. Antigone has no such choice to make, although her devaluation of marriage and motherhood, neither of which she has experienced, is both relevant and poignant, since she laments that she will go to her death unwedded. In order to explain the similarities between these two passages, which extend beyond argumentative logic to several syntactical and lexical details, Felix Jacobi envisioned three possibilities of transmission. That Herodotus either gave lectures in Athens, an option that is supported by several later testimonia, or he told stories of his travels to a circle that included Sophocles, or even allowed him to take a look at his manuscript. In Jacobi's wake, affinities between Herodotus and Sophocles have been interpreted by some to manifest Herodotean influence on Sophocles, by others to manifest Sophoclean influence on Herodotus. Over a century ago, Johannes Rasch claimed to find signs of Herodotean influence in every one of Sophocles' extant plays, and several lost or fragmentary ones. He found traces of this influence in Sophocles' geographical references and foreign words, in variations on specific passages in the histories, and in borrowed motifs that shaped the structure and subject matter of various tragedies. For example, he thought that Herodotus' saga of Cyrus's birth and exposure influenced the exposure theme in Oedipus Rex, in the Alexandros, and in the Tyro. More recently, Stephanie West has made a more focused and substantial case for Herodotus' influence upon the Antigone, reflected not only in textual parallels, but also at a deeper level in the realm of political ideology. She argues that Sophocles' portrayal of Creon is modeled upon Herodotus' portrayal of Cambyses as an autocratic violator of religious custom, responsible for his own lack of successor, who was ultimately punished by divine wrath. In West's view, since the plot of Antigone appears to incorporate, to the best of our limited knowledge, a relatively high degree of free invention, we should not be surprised if Sophocles found inspiration in Herodotus's narrative. On the other side of the ledger, Franz Egermann and Martin Ostwald have made ambitious attempts to demonstrate far-reaching Sophoclean influence on Herodotus and his vision of history. Egermann contends that Herodotus applies to historical figures the image of the great man, the heroic mention-built, that Sophocles portrays in the mythical characters of his tragedies, Antigone, Electra, Ajax, Oedipus, Philoctetes. All of these heroes demonstrate their possession of pure arete by doing what is noble rather than expedient, even at the cost of their lives, while lesser characters in their vicinity dismiss their behavior as foolish. Egermann sees the same pattern in Herodotus's portrayal of the self-sacrificial Leonidas and Megistius at Thermopylae, and what is more overtly indicative of the debt Herodotus owes to his friend Sophocles in his characterization of the Athenian people, whose perilous rejection of repeated invitations to Persian alliance embodies the triumph of high arete. The vulnerability of Egermann's argument, however, is revealed by his own demonstration that the heroic Sophoclean and Herodotean mention-built is by no means unique in the history of Greek literature, but has deep roots in Homeric epic, as well as a crowning later manifestation in Plato's portrayal of Socrates. By contrast, Ostwald is more cautious in arguing, as a plausible conjecture incapable of proof, that Herodotus's conception of the historical process is indebted to Sophocles. He believes that Herodotus and Sophocles share a perception of human life that is unique in the history of Greek literature. And you can all read this along. Just as Sophoclean drama is shaped by great individuals, an Oedipus, an Ajax, and Antigone, who in acting reasonably according to their lights fall victim to forces over which they have no control. So Herodotus sees the mainspring of historical developments in individuals placed in situations in which their decisions lead not only them, but also the people whose destiny is tied up with theirs to an end which they did not foresee. Ostwald's view of both Sophoclean and Herodotean heroes is thus darker and more nuanced than Egermann's. He emphasizes their limitations, their lack of foresight, their vulnerability to inscrutable forces beyond their control, rather than their transcendent nobility. Ostwald speculates that this shared vision might have resulted from discussions between Herodotus and Sophocles, but concedes that it is impossible to know with certainty who influenced whom. Ultimately, he's inclined to favor Sophoclean influence on Herodotus because the poet, and I'm quoting Ostwald now, was working in a tradition of tragedy which had been well established in Athens, at least since the days of Aeschylus, while we know of no such tradition to which Herodotus could have been exposed before his arrival in Athens, end of quote. Here, in my view, Ostwald, too, ignores the Homeric elephant in the room, and especially the Iliadic heroes, Achilles and Hector, both of whom could be described in the terms that Ostwald applies to Sophoclean and Herodotean heroes. By contrast, Richard Rutherford underscores more broadly the Homeric roots of both tragedy and history, and challenges the idea that Herodotus was perhaps more open to Sophoclean influence than vice versa, on practical grounds. Given the likelihood that a middle-aged Herodotus arrived in Athens in the 440s, I'm quoting Rutherford now, there is every reason to suppose that his worldview was fully formed before he ever saw a tragedy performed in the Athenian theater, end of quote. He concludes that Sophoclean influence on Herodotus is less clear than the reverse, than Herodotean influence on Sophocles, and that the story patterns and plot types shared by them may transcend genres with roots in epic or perhaps folktale. This scarcely skeletal survey of previous scholarship, and I should add, by the way, that Jan and Doris's paper on Croesus and Oedipus, which is imminent. Its publication is imminent in the classical world, as I understand. That's going to represent an important contribution to that scholarship as well. Well, as I said, this scarcely skeletal survey of scholarship makes it clear that tragic and specifically Sophoclean influence on Herodotus cannot simply be assumed. It must be argued for with an awareness of the poetic and cultural resources that Sophocles and Herodotus might have shared and drawn upon independently, as well as an awareness of the chronological uncertainties surrounding the publication of the histories and the production of Sophoclean tragedies. Well, on that sobering note, I turn now to Herodotus's story of the fatal dispute between Periander, tyrant of Corinth, and his son Lycophron. In Herodotus's telling, Periander killed his wife Melissa, who had borne him 2 sons. When Melissa's father Procles, tyrant of Epidaurus, entertained the boys and asked them if they knew who had killed their mother, only the younger son Lycophron understood the implication of the question and therefore refused to speak to his father. As a result, Periander drove Lycophron out of his household in anger. Lycophron was taken in by a series of friends until Periander made a proclamation that whoever housed Lycophron or even talked to him would owe a sacred fee to the god Apollo. Subsequently, however, Periander was moved by the wretched appearance of his son in public and tried to persuade him to inherit the tyranny and the tyrant's luxurious lifestyle. To no avail, since Lycophron's only response was to point out that his father now owed Apollo a fine for conversing with him. Periander then banished Lycophron to the Corinthian colony of Corcyra, but as he grew old, he made one last attempt to make Lycophron his heir. He sent his daughter, Lycophron's sister, to plead his case in person. Lycophron replied that he would never return to Corinth as long as his father lived. Finally, Periander proposed that he would move to Corcyra if Lycophron returned to Corinth to assume the tyranny. Lycophron agreed to do so, but when the Corcyraeans got wind of the plan, they killed Lycophron in order to prevent Periander's arrival. The extent to which this narrative contains historically reliable information is disputed. Herodotus himself appears to signal the presence of historically questionable material at the outset by describing Periander's experience as symphorein toiende, a misfortune such as follows, a misfortune such as the following. You can see it's number 4 on your screen. As Alan Griffiths has pointed out, Herodotus often uses the adjective toiaste to mark his shifting into a mythical narrative mode, a narrative register where less strict standards of verisimilitude apply. And this is one of several stories that are introduced in this way, and I mentioned a few other examples of the type, the story of Cleobus and Biton and their uncanny death in the temple of Argive Hera in response to their mother's unwitting prayer. the revelation of Cyrus's identity, the introduction to what the children's kingdom game that exposes Cyrus's true regal background, and the story that Griffiths himself discusses in his article about the blind seer Evenus. The double misfortune suffered by Periander, the death of his wife and subsequent estrangement from his son, sets a tragic tone in the broad sense of the term. And it may be significant that the noun sumphore is thematically associated with Adrastus, the unwitting murderer of Croesus' son Attis, in the Herodotean story that is most obviously indebted to tragedy. A broader similarity between the two episodes is the contrast drawn between the heroic brother, Attis and Lycophron, and his anonymous sibling. Herodotus highlights this contrast between Lycophron and his brother by noting their different responses to dogged interrogation by their father. Lycophron refuses to answer in the painful conviction that Periander killed Melissa, while his brother took no note in the first place, and in an almost comical scene, has to be browbeaten into remembering the poisonous question posed by Proclamation. Moreover, Herodotus later repeats this scenario in dramatized fashion when he quotes the speech of Lycophron's sister as she tries to persuade him to reconcile with Periander. The narrative technique of contrast between heroic and non-heroic siblings is, of course, as old as Homer. We need only think of the disparity and friction between Hector and Paris in the Iliad. However, the technique is especially prominent in Sophoclean drama, as demonstrated to a degree by the pairing of Ajax and Teucer in Ajax, but more emphatically in the relationship, more emphatically by the relationship between Antigone and Ismene in Antigone, and Electra and Chrysothemis in Electra. In the latter two instances, the lesser sister serves as a cautious advisor, warning against the serious consequences of what she perceives to be foolish and dangerous behavior. The case of Electra and Chrysothemis is, of course, especially striking because of the reason for the conflict between the two sisters. Electra risks being cast out of the palace because of her devotion to the memory of her dead father Agamemnon, while Chrysothemis, though conceding the justice of her sister's cause, practices and urges caution in order not to antagonize Clytemnestra and Aegisthus, the regicidal rulers of the house. Herodotus's narrative highlights the same familial conflict with a double change of gender. Now it is the dead mother's memory that is kept alive by the presumptive heir Lycophron to the exasperation and anger of his father, the tyrant. Once banished from his father's oikos, Lycophron finds refuge with a succession of friends who offer him temporary residence until they are ordered by the tyrant to cast him out. The proclamation of civic excommunication, ultimately issued by Periander, forbidding anyone to house or speak to Lycophron, resembles the proclamation declared by Sophocles' unwitting Oedipus against the unknown murderer of Laius. And these are numbers 5a and 5b on your screen. Oedipus forbids anyone to take in or address the king's murderer or admit him to religious rites. He does so on the authority of Apollo's Pythian oracle. Now, for his part, Periander declares that anyone who either takes a Lycophron into their home or speaks to him, hos an e oikioisi, padexe taimin e pros dialecthe, must pay a fine to Apollo. While the god's relevance is clear in his Sophoclean context, the reason for his presence in Herodotus' story is not immediately obvious. Christiane Sorvino-Inwood finds an explanation in Apollo's role of presiding over the initiation of adolescent males. This suits her analysis of the story as a whole as a mythopoeic narrative whose roots lie in initiatory ritual, a test that Lycophron fails to pass since he fails to succeed his father as tyrant. While this explanation may be true, Herodotus could also be acknowledging the Sophoclean passage as his source, especially since the excommunication issued by Periander is more appropriate for someone who has committed a great crime and could therefore pollute others by merely consorting or conversing with them. Sorvino Inwood duly notes that Lycophron is treated as though he had killed Periander and argues that, as manifestations of the father-son hostility schema that structures Herodotus's narrative, turning against the father and killing the father are symbolically equivalent. In my own less sophisticated analysis, Herodotean borrowing and recontextualization of the OT passage would serve to lend the Corinthian narrative mythical depth and resonance, while at the same time highlighting the harshness of Periander's tyrannical rule, exercised knowingly at the expense of his own son. But soon the sight of Lycophron, unwashed and unfed in the arcades of the Corinthian agora, elicits Periander's pity. The description of Lycophron's condition, let's see, we want to, we'll be looking at numbers 6a, b, and c here. Let me get back here, where was I? The description of Lycophron's condition, this is 6a on your handout. Aluciesi tekai asitiesi sympeptokota is striking. It has several poetic parallels in epic and tragedy. Wolfgang Ali compares the Sophoclean description of Ajax as kakois sympeptokota. This is 6b on your handout. Neither of Herodotus's dative plural nouns occurs elsewhere in the history, so they are both hapaxes. And while there are Homeric parallels for dative plural nouns devoting misfortunes of various kinds, atastaliesin, for example, these specific nouns, that is, Herodotus's specific nouns, are not among them. They are, however, found in a pair of Euripidean passages in Suppliant Women. So we're looking at 6c now. The aged Iphis envisions his body as wasting away asitiais. And in Orestes, this is also in 6c, Electra laments how her brother has grown savage, diamakras alusias. In his conspicuously wretched squalor, Lycophron also resembles representations of Electra on the tragic stage. The Sophoclean Electra, now we're looking at 6d, the Sophoclean Electra laments her unseemly attire and the empty tables at which she stands, while Chrysothemis enjoys royal privileges and a rich diet, literally a wealthy table. Her Euripidean counterpart, moving from 6d1 to 6d2, a peasant farmer's wife, bewails her filthy hair and tattered clothes, and more vividly still, the dirt with which she is encrusted, the Pinot. Herodotus then dramatizes the encounter between father and son, giving Periander a speech that includes several features that are staples of tragic drama. Periander emphasizes the issues of choice. Again, Periander emphasizes the issues of choice and familial, which is to say paternal loyalty. He asks Lycophron which is his preferred choice, hieretotera, to accommodate his father by inheriting the tyranny and the tyrant's lavish lifestyle, or to live the vagrant life that he has chosen, heleo, in angry defiance of the man who least deserves such treatment. In explaining why Lycophron should return home, Periander strikes a distinctly Sophoclean note when reminding his son of the price that he has paid for his, let's see, 8a, this is 8a, right. So again, Periander strikes a distinctly Sophoclean note when reminding Lycophron of the price that he's paid for his anger against his parents and those who are more powerful. Sophoclean heroines hear similar warnings from their sisters. Chrysothemis, this is 8b, numbers 1 and 2. Chrysothemis urges Electra not to indulge her anger uselessly against those in power, that is, their mother and her consort Aegisthus. So you can see what thumo and what corresponding to tethymosthai in Herodotus's text. And again, Periander warns Lycophron about this show of anger against what estus cressonas, and Chrysothemis says that those in power, tone cratun tone, must be heeded in all matters. And in 8b2 as well, Chrysothemis urges Electra to yield to tois kratusen, to those in power. Similarly, Ismene in 8b3 cautions Antigone that it's senseless to resist their uncle and Creon's edict forbidding the burial of their brother Polynices, since we are ruled by those with greater power, ton chresonon. Moreover, Lycophron's curt response to his father that Periander now owes Apollo a fine for conversing with him and thus violating his own edict recalls the irony of Oedipus's unwillingly self-damning proclamation, although with consequences that are less grave. If Herodotus' narrative contains familiar tragic features, however, they do not include unity of time or place. As Herodotus continues the story, Periander resigns himself to Lycophron's intransigence and sends him off to Corcyra. Then he marches against Epidaurus, capturing the city and its tyrant Procles, his father-in-law, whom he blames most of all for the rupture with Lycophron. Subsequently, the aging Periander makes 2 attempts to reclaim Lycophron as heir to his rule in Corinth, since he sees no promise in his elder son. After Lycophron refuses to respond to a messenger sent by his father, Periander sends his own daughter, Lycophron's sister, to Corcyra to plead his case a second time. Again, Herodotus dramatizes the scene by giving the sister a speech, followed by a short response from Lycophron, reported in indirect discourse. Among the sister's arguments, which have a marked gnomic character that may reflect her father's status as one of the 7 sages, 2 paired statements are of special interest for my purpose, and you see them before you here. Many people prefer what is more reasonable to what is just, and many people have already, by pursuing their mother's rights, thrown away their paternal inheritance. Lycophron's sister thereby urges him, in assessing the competing claims of loyalty to mother and father, not to act in strict accordance with justice, which would sanction punishment of Periander for Melissa's death. Instead, she proposes the more lenient standard of reasonable or fair behavior, ta epi ekestera, preferred by many, which would acknowledge the mitigating circumstances that she mentions, including the desirability of tyrannical power and possessions and the advanced age of their father. Here too, the Sophoclean Electra offers a striking parallel, since she is accused by the chorus and her sister of acting unreasonably or immoderately in her obstinate commitment to seeking justice on her father's behalf. Significantly, when she first arrives on stage, Chrysothemis defends her own pragmatic choice of subservience to Agamemnon's killers, but acknowledges the justice of Electra's perilous paternal devotion. And this is 9b on your handout. Justice lies not in what I say, but in what you choose or judge or decide. When Lycophron's sister ends her speech, Herodotus points out in his own narrative voice that she marshaled her arguments as taught by her father. This is 10a. Electra levels a similar charge that Clytemnestra taught Chrysothemis how to admonish her. This is 10b that you see before you. In his brief response to his sister, recorded an indirect statement, Lycophron vows that as long as he hears that his father is alive, he will never, udama, 11a here, return to Corinth. This is one of the emphatic, uncompromising terms with which Sophoclean heroes announce their resolve to act, as Bernard Knox pointed out, and as Electra vows repeatedly. I've given you a couple of examples in 11b1 and 2, udepot and uk anpot, as you can see. Finally, Lycophron's killing by the Corcyraeans to prevent the arrival of his father, the tyrant, gives Herodotus's narrative ironic twists of a kind familiar from Sophoclean tragedy. The motif of action undertaken too late to prevent catastrophe, Periander's inability to secure his succession and ultimately to save his son's life, has parallels in the vain efforts of Tecmessa, Teucer, and the chorus to prevent Ajax's suicide, and in Creon's tardy attempt to inter Polycrates and disinter Antigone, which results in a pair of suicides by Antigone and Creon's son, Haemon. The similarity between Sophocles' Creon and Herodotus' Periander is especially remarkable since both change their minds at the last minute, making important concessions to their antagonists that nonetheless fail to bear fruit. Creon is convinced by Tiresias that he was wrong to deny Polynices' burial and entomb Antigone, while Periander agrees to relocate to Corcyra so that Lycophron may assume the tyranny in Corinth. More broadly, Periander's repeated efforts to make Lycophron his political heir miscarry, and his last stratagem to secure the succession, his intended departure for Corcyra, unwittingly precipitates the death of his son, and as far as Herodotus is concerned at least, the end of the Cypselid tyranny. A dark discrepancy between intention and outcome, reminiscent of the Sophoclean Oedipus, as well as Croesus's attempts to save the life of his son Attis. It is worth noting that according to Nicolaus of Damascus, by contrast, Periander was succeeded as tyrant of Corinth, though briefly, by his nephew, son of Gorgos, named Cypselus in some sources, Psammetichus in others. For Sorvino Inwood, these conflicting versions represent two refractions of the historical fact, failed succession, told once by Nicolaus in the language of historical narrative, and once by Herodotus in mythological language. For all of this, however, there's one opportunity to intensify the tragic nature of the Periander and Lycophron narrative that Herodotus declines to capitalize upon. Since the end of the Cypselid tyranny after 2 generations was in fact predicted by an oracle, subsequently quoted in the Corinthian Sophocles' speech opposing the Spartan reestablishment of tyrannical rule in Athens in 592. That's Herodotus 592, not the year. Thus, while Herodotus might have underscored in familiar, tragic, and especially Sophoclean fashion the overdetermined nature of Lycophron's death, he chooses instead and for whatever reasons, to focus solely on the human plane of agency in this instance, unlike his treatments of the deaths of such rulers as Croesus, Cyrus, Cambyses, and Polycrates. In summary, the similarities in narrative technique and themes between Herodotus's narrative and Sophoclean tragedy are numerous and substantial, from the basic plot, which pits siblings against one another in their divergent attitudes to the memory of a dead parent, to more detailed motifs and themes, including the tyrant's excommunicatory ban that he himself violates, Periander's reminding Lycophron of the futility of venting anger against those in power, Lycophron's vow never to cooperate as long as his father rules in Corinth, and the ironic discrepancy between Periander's intention to perpetuate his rule and the death suffered by Lycophron at the hands of the Corcyraeans. But how best to explain these affinities? That's the million-dollar question. In my view, they are specific enough to suggest the dependence of one author upon the other, which is to say the dependence of Herodotus upon Sophocles. Here, the chronological evidence is slippery, since the dating of both Sophoclean plays and Herodotus's publication is disputed, and each author may have had pre-publication access to the other's work. Nonetheless, I consider it telling that Herodotus signals the mythical register of his narrative at the outset with the adjective toiaste. Of the specific Sophoclean plays most relevant to Periander and Lycophron, the Antigone and Oedipus Tyrannus, at least, are widely thought to predate the publication of the histories, even though Sophocles incorporated Herodotean material into Antigone. And P.J. Finglass can envision a possible Herodotean origin for Oedipus's excommunicatory proclamation. However, the Sophoclean play whose plot most closely resembles Herodotus's narrative is Electra, a tragedy commonly believed to have been produced in the 410s. In Finglass's words, almost certainly from after Herodotus's lifetime. The adverbial qualification, almost certainly, attests to the exasperating limitations of our evidence for both the play's dating and Herodotus's longevity. Finglass acknowledges that the next most likely decade for the first production of Electra is the 420s, a decade that many scholars believe Herodotus lived to see, while Liz Irwin has recently made the bold argument that Herodotus lived to see the end of the Peloponnesian War and published the histories in its wake. In any case, if Herodotus knew Sophocles' play, we would have in the Electra a plausible model for some of the tragic stylization of the Periander and Lycophron narrative. To be clear, this scenario would not make Herodotus simply and utterly dependent upon Sophocles, since the gender reversal of the hero is a significant departure that entails significant narrative differences linked to the expected social outcomes for males and females in classical Greece. Consequently, while Electra bewails her lack of a husband and children, Herodotus focuses on the son's unwillingness to succeed his father as heir, an inheritance that is a public as well as a private concern, since Periander is no ordinary father, but the tyrant of Corinth as well. If the generational tension between a father and his sons is a concern throughout the history of Greek literature, and indeed throughout Greek history itself, Herodotus's amplification of this focal point is especially noticeable in the speeches that he creates for Lycophron's father and sister. Nino Larraghi has argued that this narrative reached Herodotus already implotted as a fully developed story, which he then linked to the Spartan expedition against Polycrates in order to evoke a web of Hellenic hostilities involving Samos, Sparta, Corinth, and Corcyra, relevant to the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War in the late 430s. If this hypothesis is correct, the question remains just how fully developed the pre-Herodotean story was, and how Herodotus shaped the tradition in his turn. I myself would hypothesize that in addition to framing the story in a way that evoked contemporary political tensions, Herodotus also developed the tragic potential of its events in various ways that reflect Sophoclean models. In his repurposing of a banishment proclamation by Oedipus, more suitable for a murderer than a recalcitrant and resentful son, in his vivid description of the banished Lycophron's squalor, in his highlighting ironic discrepancies between the intent and the outcome of human actions, and in his fashioning of speeches for Lycophron's interlocutors, one of them a sibling advising caution, speeches that underscore issues of choice, family conflict, and the cost of anger vented against the powerful in the interest of justice. Whether or not Herodotus lived to see the first production of Electra, his staging of the generational conflict between Periander and Lycophron, committed to justice for his mother's sake, no matter what the cost, reads in many ways like an adoption and adaptation of Sophoclean storytelling techniques.